Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate and for your flexibility in being able to participate virtually. I think I've been able to listen to the dialogue this morning, and I'm really excited about hearing the rest of the conversation throughout the day. So again, thank you so much for the flexibility and for inviting me to participate. Wanted to just talk briefly about one of the pieces that was part of the introduction, which is the fact that Denver has taken this step, which is pretty unique across the country, of recognizing that housing investments and investments to serve people who are experiencing homelessness are key critical support that are provided by a city to serve its residents, and have been put together from a resource, from a staffing, partnership approach into one new standalone department within Denver. It's a cabinet level department with a budget of almost $75 million that we're working to grow and expand. So I think that's a significant step that Denver has taken, and I wanted to give you just a little bit of background about some of the work that we're doing across that entire housing continuum, and then look forward to turning this over to Annalise to talk a little bit more about a specific policy geared towards zoning for affordable housing. So I can go on to the next slide. Here we go. So wanted to just give a little bit of a framework for how we think about our work across the entire housing continuum. And I certainly have themes here that I believe have been reflected as part of your conversation already this morning. That housing prices here in Denver are out of reach, especially for those at the lowest income levels. And the stock that we have available and affordable to the residents at low and middle income levels is really mismatched to the significant need. While incomes have grown in Denver and in Colorado, as I heard earlier speakers address in the Washington area, they have been a slow growth compared to what has been an explosion in housing prices. So we have a significant gap in affordability. We have taken the step here in Denver to raise the minimum wage to almost $16 over the course of the next couple of years. So they will, there will be support to raise incomes on that side, but we have a lot of work to do on the housing side as well. Want to recognize and address that trauma and health issues both contribute to and are a symptom of homelessness and need to be addressed as part of our overall housing strategy to serve residents who are experiencing homelessness. And certainly what we see in Denver is not unique across the country, but we have an impact of historic and current racial disparities in our need for housing and in our residents who are experiencing homelessness. So our approach is really to promote housing that is affordable, safe, and healthy, and that provides a stable platform to address any personal or household needs as a component of a housing first strategy. Wanted to give you a couple of data points from Denver on homelessness, and we'll talk a little bit about housing as well. Overall population growth in Denver has been significant over the last several years. The next slide will show a little bit more there. And while we have seen some fluctuation in residents who are experiencing homelessness, it has not been at the same overall increase that we have seen in the population in Denver in general. Especially levels of unsheltered homelessness have stayed relatively consistent since 2015. And really, 1 in 5 people experiencing homelessness in Denver is part of a family. How we track and collect this information is through a point-in-time survey, which is a tool that's utilized across the country. It's largely considered to be an undercount and gives us just a picture of one night in January each year when we do these assessments and analysis of who might be experiencing homelessness in our community. But it does give us data that helps to inform our investments and helps to inform our overall strategies related to homelessness. We recognize that we need housing resources across the entire continuum. This is just one quick visual to help you understand some of the growth in overall populations compared to what we have seen in that annual point-in-time count as far as people who are experiencing homelessness, and this is unique to the city and county of Denver. We've had a 15% increase in our overall population in Denver over the last several years since 2012. You can see the fluctuation on an annual, on the night for the point in time has changed over the last several years. We have not seen that comparable increase in people experiencing homelessness in the city. A couple of key data points from Denver on housing. I mentioned that 15% increase in population since 2012. Our rent and home prices have really soared over that same period of time. Median rent for all apartments has increased 68% over that same time frame. And we've really, while that's a significant increase on the rental side, our prices on the homeownership side have been even larger as far as the growth since 2012. For single family homes, 137% since 2012 in growth, and 168% for attached product, which is a significant barrier for attainable homeownership for our residents who are struggling to keep up with housing costs here in the city. About 46% of all of our rental households are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. About 24% of our homeownership households are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And that equates for those earning less than the median income to over 96,000 or approximately 96,000 households, which is a significant number of households that are struggling to keep up with housing costs in the city of Denver. We keep a dashboard on our website that really has a lot of interesting information. It talks about need for housing. It talks about our investments. It talks about what programs and projects are available because of city investments or partnerships. It's denvergov.org/housing for anyone who might be interested in taking a look at that. But one of the things that we track on that dashboard is the residents who are cost burdened compared to the city's available income restricted housing units. And what I wanted to highlight on this page is that 96,000 cost burdened households who are earning less than the median income in the city compared to our income restricted stock. We have about 23,000 affordable income restricted units within the city of Denver. That's because of city investment, because of other partnerships, because of federal and state investment. But that means if you look at those two numbers side by side, there's about 4 cost burdened households for every 1 income restricted unit that's available. So that's a pretty significant need and drives a lot of our work to help build and preserve our existing housing stock on the preservation side, as well as increase that through our investments and our policy strategies. We have about 320,000 units within the city of Denver, total market rate and affordable. So our income restricted stock at a little over 23,000 really represents about 7% of the total housing stock within the city of Denver that is affordable and income restricted. Certainly that doesn't reflect units that are market rate affordable because they are older product or outside of downtown or might be aging housing stock. But for our income restricted units, that's about 7% of the city's total stock. We've done a few calculations of what would it take to get to 8%, what would it take to get to 10%. It would take us adding about 8,700 units to our affordable housing stock to get to 10%. We have a vision of building or preserving about 6,000 units over the next 5 years. So if we were able to add more resources to our portfolio, able to expand the tools that we have, we could do more than 6,000 units. We could reach that faster, but that's some of what we think about as we think about growing our income restricted stock to help match the need. I think Elise is going to talk a little bit more about some of our citywide recommendations, but our affordable housing strategies are really anchored in our citywide strategies, including a comprehensive plan for the city, as well as a land use and transportation plan for the city of Denver. There has been a lot of outreach that's been happening within the city over the last several years as we've worked to update those plans and adopt those plans through our city council. But a big piece of the feedback that we heard from residents as we were going out and asking them what their most important elements are of a city, city plan, city vision for the next 20 plus years. Equitability, affordability, and inclusivity were among the top pieces of feedback that we heard from residents, and our planning department really led those efforts and spearheaded the development of those plans. We do have a housing plan that complements those long-range citywide land use and transportation plans. Our 5-year plan is called Housing and Inclusive Denver. We have really 4 key goals that are included as part of this plan to create affordable housing both in vulnerable areas as well as areas of opportunity where there's access to transit, access to other key amenities that help support residents in addition to the affordable housing, to preserve our existing affordable housing restrictions and the quality of the units that are part of our existing portfolio, to really promote equitable and accessible housing options by connecting people to available housing and stabilizing residents at risk of displacement. Another key focus for us as part of our 5-year housing plans and work across the entire continuum is some of the prioritization of our use of resources to serve residents across the entire continuum. And when I say continuum, we think about this both from a median income where they fall, where residents who need city services fall along a median income, but also what type of services they may need, whether it's to stabilize them in the home they already live in or to connect them to new housing. These are maybe some of the ways that we help support residents through our interventions. But our housing plan really prioritizes resources across the housing continuum on the income side, with the majority of our resources to be dedicated to serve residents at the lowest income levels. So 40 to 50% of our resources serve residents experiencing homelessness and those who earn below 30% of the area median income in Denver. We really want to provide both housing as well as supportive services for residents at the lowest income levels and who are experiencing homelessness. The other portion of our resources, the other about 50 to 60% of our resources, are utilized to serve residents who need rental housing from 31 to 80% of the area median income, and then those who are seeking to become homeowners or maintain the homes that they already live in. We track these expenditures on an annual basis. That's also on the dashboard that I mentioned earlier, so that we can see how we're calibrating those investment goals over a 5-year period. I mentioned that we think about our tools in the way that they impact residents in resolving an experience of homelessness, helping someone to stabilize in a home that they already live in, and then to create, preserve, and promote access to new housing opportunities as part of our housing opportunity bucket. So this slide first focuses on those investments as well as policy strategies that help residents who might be experiencing homelessness to quickly resolve their experience of homelessness. We're focused on making sure that homelessness is rare, brief, and one time. So we invest in street outreach and navigation to really help connect residents to permanent housing and resources. Our entire approach to addressing the needs of residents experiencing homelessness is through a rehousing strategy. How do we divert them from experiencing homelessness, but how do we also quickly resolve that experience through connection to permanent housing? So we do invest into some transitional and shelter support services as well as operations, but a lot of what we're focused on here is the prevention and rehousing strategies that connect residents to supportive housing with the level of services that match their acuity. If they're a highly vulnerable individual, the housing that they need would come with a strong amount of supportive services through mental behavioral health. But some people might just need an affordable unit. And so connecting to a voucher, connecting to an income restricted unit is part of what we might be referring them to. And we utilize a coordinated entry system like other areas throughout the country to help connect residents to the most appropriate permanent housing solution based on their level of need. On the housing opportunity side, this is really where we focus on creating and preserving affordable housing and promoting access to housing opportunities. So we have a lot of our activity in this space, including investments as well as policy strategies. And I'm just going to tee some of this up at a high level because Annalise is going to talk a little bit more about some of our zoning strategies that complement the city's investments to help create affordable housing at key sites throughout the city. We have investments into new construction and preservation, as I mentioned, but also into some of the tools and programmatic assistance that helps connect people to those affordable units, things like down payment assistance, as well as counseling services and supportive services for those residents who are experiencing homelessness. We have an ordinance within the city of Denver that gives us the right to purchase an affordable property that is income restricted and might be at risk of converting to market rate. Our preservation ordinance is what that's called. It also really promotes long-term affordability as part of our overall policy strategy. We have a requirement that any affordable unit within the city of Denver is affordable for at least 60 years. And it incentivizes perpetual affordability by waiving our right of first refusal if a project records a perpetual covenant. So we're really driving towards that long-term affordability. We had an inclusionary ordinance that applied until 2016 to all for sale development throughout the city. We are limited by our ability to restrict the affordability of rental units under an inclusionary approach because of state restrictions on rent control. So we did have an affordable homeownership requirement, but we did replace that with a more broadly applicable linkage fee. This is a per square foot fee on all new development within the city and county of Denver. It's generating about $10 million for us this year based on collection from commercial as well as residential. And this linkage fee has both a fee requirement and a unit alternative. So you can build units in lieu of paying that fee. And that's part of what has driven some of our height incentives that Annalise will talk a little bit more about in a moment. But that's complemented by our negotiations when developers of what would typically be market rate redevelopment projects are utilizing city incentives like zoning, like tax increment financing. We're negotiating for affordable housing at those sites as part of the utilization of those city tools, but also with a waiver of our linkage fee because they're building units instead of paying that fee. And then finally, just wanted to talk about some of the tools that we're utilizing for stability. This is really trying to keep people in the homes they already live in. I think someone in an earlier session mentioned that the home that might be most affordable to you is the home that you already live in. It costs a lot to move. It costs a lot to put a new down payment or a new first and last month's rent at an apartment. So really trying to keep people stabilized in the home they already live in. We utilize home repair programs on the home ownership side, rent and utility assistance mostly on the rental side, as well as counseling and legal assistance to help prevent evictions. We had a study here done locally in the last couple of years that indicated that when a resident is going through an eviction process, especially at the lowest income level, only about 1% to 2% of those residents had legal counsel that was supporting them through that eviction process, where most of the landlords had legal counsel as part of their eviction process. So part of what we provide for residents is the actual legal assistance to help navigate and prevent eviction, because sometimes there can be alternative paths to eviction. And so really trying to divert that so that we can prevent homelessness as well. We have property tax rebate programs to help people keep up with rising housing costs, as well as some key policy approaches here. We adopted last year a protection against discrimination on the basis of their source of income, which really helps for residents who have vouchers, who are trying to access market rate units. some limitations on application fees, warranty of habitability here at the state level. And I heard ADUs mentioned, accessory dwelling units mentioned a couple times throughout the morning. And I think this is a key area where we have both investments and zoning tools to help create more on the supply side through accessory dwelling units, but also to help with programmatic assistance for ADUs to help keep people in their homes and utilize ADUs as a wealth building tool that generates income for a lower moderate income family as well. So with that, I will pause and turn it over to Annalise to talk a little bit more about the zoning tools that we're using here in Denver to promote mixed income housing.
Great, thank you so much. Annalise Hoke here, a principal city planner with the City and County of Denver. I'm going to try to keep this really brief since I'm really just going to focus on one of the tools that we in Denver have been exploring, and that's really how do we better leverage our land use tools. I think historically we put a lot of the onus on housing solutions, on our housing departments and federal subsidies, and with those continuing to decrease, I think our planning and zoning departments really need to step up and kind of take the opportunity in terms of how we better address this. So this is a very simplified graphic of some of the different factors that we know affect housing cost holistically. There's hard cost, materials, and labor, and that at a global issue, we're seeing those rise rapidly, but at a local issue, we really don't have a lot of leverage over that, as well as financing tools, but I don't do finance, I'm a planner. So what I'm going to really focus on is how do we move forward in terms of policy of land availability and sufficient infrastructure, as well as examining the regulations in which housing exists. And so I think to really start, we have to, before we get into all the new like fancy exciting tools and innovations out there, if we don't have our foundation right from a land use regulation standpoint, it's really going to be hard to get those aspects. So a couple of questions that I want to ask each of you guys here today is first starting with your comprehensive plans, your specific area-wide plans. Are those developed in a way that they are promoting a variety of housing types and needs across the community, and especially in areas of near transit, downtown, and what we in Denver use this term of areas of opportunity quite often, areas that have access to housing as well as jobs, to really promote this idea of a complete neighborhood. So within a 10-mile walk, can you access everything that you need from healthcare services to jobs to food and so forth? So one, make sure that your land use plans are updated and reflective of what the community actually needs today and in the future. Let's not have plans that are dusty and sit on the shelf. And then I think the second piece is are we actually implementing our comprehensive plans? Do our zoning code and our land development regulations actually align with them, or is there that disconnect? So moving forward succinctly and efficiently on the implementation of those plans. Also, I think when we jump to our land use code, we need to make sure that we're removing those barriers that just currently exist that are adding cost to housing. So a lot of communities that I've worked in, from Rochester to Reno to Fort Collins, all of them really love their maximum density standards because it gets neighbors feeling safe about what can happen. And in Denver, we did a holistic update to our zoning code in 2010. And with the exception of our single unit and 2-unit zone districts, we do not have a single maximum density standard. So if people want to come in and do micro units or smaller studio bedrooms, there's no limitation to that. And so that really opens up some of the doors. Also eliminating minimum lot sizes. We are seeing bigger and bigger homes being built, but that really doesn't meet the need. We're seeing a decrease in our household size. So in the 1960s, the average house was 1,200 square feet, but we had 3 or 4 person household. We've essentially flip-flopped that. We've cut our household sizes in half, but we've doubled it. So if we can remove those especially parking is expensive. And as was noted earlier, we need to realize too that when we're putting housing near transit, those vehicle parking requirements may not be as required. We need to stop letting engineers dictate our parking standards. Cumbersome development standards, I'm not going to list them off, but we all know that we have them and we need to re-examine their value. And then also unpredictable and lengthy approval processes. When we have to go out in public meetings for by right development, and the example that was provided earlier with Jana, if you're inviting opportunities for NIMBYs, you're adding cost and unpredictability to it. And the community is critical, but I firmly believe that the community is really appropriate to engage at the holistic scale at the planning process and not on the site-by-site what is happening specifically to our next door, because we're going to speak in our own best interest as opposed to the community interest. So we did away with a lot of those in 2010, but what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the land use standards that we can be better leveraging to support it, and that's through value capture, flexible development standards, and clear and predictable streamlined approval processes. So tell them, this is what you got to do, and once you meet it, we're going to move forward and permit you. So this concept of value capture, I do want to just kind of give a bit of a definition, because I think people define it different ways, and that's absolutely fine. But I really see it as a tool that allows for communities to share for a portion of that increased land value that was resultive of public investment or other government action. So, the idea here in the core premise is that public action, such as putting in new light rail stops, putting in new parks, and other sorts of infrastructure should increase your property value. And as part of that increase in property value, the community should be benefiting. So you might have a by right zoning entitlement of, say, 3 stories, but because you're by a light rail, will allow you to go to a higher height. But in exchange for that, you need to better benefit the community itself. Value capture is a broad term, and I think that there's a lot of different tools that can be captured under it. I'm not going to read because you all can, but the ones that are bolded are different tools that Denver is currently leveraging. And what I'm going to talk about is just a specific zoning incentive at the 38th and Blake station area. As you can see, the station platform, this was right when it opened, and there's been a lot more construction, but it's quite close to downtown. It's one stop from Denver Union Station, and this was really an area that in 2015 or so, our councilman came back, and he was all excited about value capture and the opportunity, and he said, and a lot of the developers are saying, we can do more here. This is really a fantastic opportunity. It's an area that had been historically industrial and was quickly turning over to kind of an artist and residential community. And so with that, we engaged in a planning process to reevaluate our existing land use plans and also figure out, okay, if we're going to have a conversation about upzoning, though, what is the appropriate community benefit? And so this project kind of had 3 main goals and objectives. One of them was to direct growth in areas that we know are best able to accommodate change. So in terms of areas of opportunity, it has close proximity to downtown. It's also on the same light rail that goes to our international airport, so great for jobs and employment at the regional standpoint. And Denver's growth strategy really does try to highlight putting that growth and intensity near areas of opportunity and transit. So we wanted to put growth there. We also wanted to promote high quality design. This was also coupled with a design overlay. A lot of people say, I don't mind tall buildings, but I mind ugly tall buildings. And while I don't have a ton of time to talk about that, that was an important aspect of this project. And then also, how do we capture a portion of that increased value to better benefit the community? So just a couple of key points. So that this has only been effective since 2018. So it's been in 2 years in effect, really. And we've had a lot of opportunities to evaluate it, and I'll talk about those outcomes. But essentially, it establishes a maximum base height. Denver is generally in a form-based code. So instead of having FAR or density requirements, we say, here's your box that you can build in, do whatever you please, so long as you meet these design standards of transparency and entries and step backs and so forth. So it establishes base heights that are variable based off of its proximity to either the low-lying residential areas to the south or its proximity to the transit station. And then it establishes maximum incentive heights And so within that delta of base and incentive, some additional affordability requirements come in. So there's a base height, let's say, of 3 stories. If you want to build incentive, as Laura made mention before, we're using a tool of our linkage fee as a multiplier. To get that incentive height, you're having to provide 4 times what the citywide linkage fee would have required. The affordability requirements is at 80% AMI, and it requires a comparable mix of housing types. So if you have a mixture of 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, and studios, you can't do studios as all of your affordable units. It needs to better reflect that. And it also builds in a system that allows for commercial projects or mixed-use projects to be able to leverage this incentive. So it's not only looking at one development type. I'm not going to go through this because it's a lot of numbers and we're tight on time, but since this will be posted online, it kind of gives you an example of how the calculations occur. This here is just a quick map. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the darkest blue there where it says 27, all of those are major projects. When I say major projects, it's anything over 2 units, but really many of these are 5- and 8-story buildings and developments. But 27 of these projects occurred prior to the overlay. And why I want to make note on that is I think that we kind of caught the tail end of the development boom in this station area. But a lot of action was already occurring where we weren't being able to leverage any of that community benefits. We didn't have a system in place, even though the train station was already constructed and built. We have about a total of 8 of these projects that just moved forward within the base entitlement and height and didn't leverage any of that incentive system, and then a total of 10 that have either been approved or pending approval that have leveraged that. So we have a little bit more than half that have been leveraging it, but I'll kind of speak to what we're finding, and that's just a little bit redundant, so I'm going to skip over it for the sake of time. So in terms of what we think this system is doing well, as I move into lessons learned, it creates a pretty predictable and easily to administer process. A lot of communities, and in other parts of our city actually right now, we're doing a lot of one-off negotiations because this is so important and we don't have a strong tool to do it. One thing that Laura touched on before is that state limits our ability significantly when it comes to rental housing and requirements, and I just want to tack onto this. Part of why we have to leverage incentives is because we cannot have any sort of inclusionary requirement on rental housing in the state of Colorado. So that's a huge roadblock. We're really hopeful with our partners at the state that might open up, but just want to also plug that incentives are really an important tool for us here in Denver. So it creates a predictable and administrative process, and why I say predictability is so important is because when you have unpredictability, that adds time to the projects, it adds review cycles, it means that really good projects might go away. So that is something that it does well. It both, as I made mention, captures residential as well as commercial projects, and we're putting growth where we want to. We're supporting our land use plans, effectively implementing that, and then because it is so systematic, we have a good system for monitoring and tracking, which is how I've been able to pull those numbers really quickly and see where our successes and drawbacks are. The drawbacks maybe are a longer list right now. One thing that Denver has really struggled with is what I would say is we have really aspirational entitlement. Following the 80s and the oil crash, kind of downtown died, urban renewal, and we were like, okay, what's going on? And I think that Denver sometimes still thought that it was in its teenage phase of I'm just gonna date whoever I can instead of being strategic about it. And part of that was we just wanted some development to occur. We wanted to bring jobs in, and so we said, we're gonna, we'll zone this 20 stories and because it's near a transit station and see what we can get, and we get a 3-story walk-up. And so because of that, though, we're also really afraid to take away entitlement and downzone. And so a lot of what that previous entitlement and those base heights were set at, it supported, 8-story buildings without any provision of additional community benefits. So we didn't have that conversation at that time. Also, sometimes the market's just really not there. Our plans are aspirational. They're looking to the future and where the current market is. They might be building lower. kind of spoke to this already. We had a limited ability to kind of introduce incentives without downzoning that were really meaningful. I would say our political context has certainly changed in recent years, and that's something that we'll be exploring citywide. And then also, height's not always the most meaningful incentive, in the sense that for many of you who are builders, you understand, or architects, that really once you go between 5, 6, 7, 8 stories, you're unable to build stick, and then you're introducing steel and concrete, which significantly add cost. And so there's kind of this middle ground delta that no one's ever actually going to leverage the incentive. And so we're wanting to look at other things beyond just density and height that we can better leverage. Also, our assumptions that we use to do this, since it's based off of square footage, instead of say you must provide 10 or 20% affordable, yields pretty unpredictable outcomes. One of our projects yielded 4% affordable, which was very low. Another one yielded 8%. And also the yields were much lower because we assumed much larger unit sizes than what's actually being provided in the market. And then also there's just kind of one flat incentive. So in terms of reaching those deeper AMI levels that we know where there's a higher need of cost burden, say the 40, 50, 60%, there's no incentive to do that, nor is there any incentive to go to a larger family-friendly unit. So it's been 2 years, and we could continue to go around station area to station area and have conversations with developers of that area and the communities, but we would get really inconsistent and varied approaches. And it wouldn't be equitable, because the people that have strong NIMBYism would be able to suppress that, and neighborhoods that have generally been run over would potentially continue to be. So what we are trying to do, and kicking off this year, is a citywide implementation of a height incentive and other zoning tool incentive program that would create a systematic way of encouraging the creation of mixed income housing, especially in transit-rich areas. A couple of our guiding principles that I would say is it needs to be equitable, in the sense that while we're working to create one citywide system, we also realize that the needs of our Denver neighborhoods and communities look very different. We have a lot of equity metrics in terms of vulnerability, and so the system needs to be responsive to those needs. Some areas, yeah, it might be okay to build a lot of studios, or in other areas we want to further incentivize deeper affordability or family-friendly units. So looking at that, also looking at the market reality, is this going to be appropriate for different contexts? Downtown core is going to look very different in terms of what it can support from a market standpoint, as opposed to our more further out neighborhoods. Clear expectations, predictability, I'm going to come back to. And then I think also accountability. A lot of times we as planners are like, oh, we implemented that. Bye, right? And so we want to be able to have a great system in place that we can hold ourselves accountable, track it, and modify it as needed, realizing that housing needs are constantly changing, market needs are constantly changing, and so having that built in is going to be really important. Then just the last side there. So as I'm talking here to other communities, it's always interesting to learn what they're doing, but kind of my advice to you is start with the simple things that maybe aren't always actually so simple, but remove those existing land use barriers. Be proactive to the best of your ability. Try to get ahead of those development pressures. We know where it's happening. We can see the trends, so do that. Create easy to administer predictable systems. When you create guessing games, no one wins. The community gets frustrated because they don't know what they can expect, and the development community is also frustrated. Don't ask for 20 different types of community benefits. Don't ask for public art, and for open space, and for affordable housing, and for additional materials. I mean, the list goes on. I've worked on some codes where they had over 20, and the staff didn't even know what they were asking for anymore. So pick 1, 2, 3 at most, make them meaningful, and then commit to ongoing evaluation as needed. As I said, all of these things change. And then Laura and I are both speaking because it's really important that this isn't just a planning issue or a housing issue, and it's not just an economic development issue. All of these aspects need to come together in terms of the implementation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. This is our project website. We have a lot more information that I could have gotten into. Give me a call or email anytime. Thanks.
All right, is everything working? Okay, before I start. Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry I can't be there to talk in person, but I'm going to do my best from here in Colorado. It's a real privilege to be part of this forum, and I want to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Medeiros, for being so accommodating. I'm also realizing I'm in that unenviable position between you and lunch, so I'm going to try to be concise here and then make sure I leave enough time for a good Q&A session before lunch starts. Since one of our main goals today is really to provide you with information and examples that are relevant to your own work, I think it's important that I start by providing some context. And I just realized my video is not working. There we go. So my colleagues from Denver did a really nice job of providing sort of our larger regional context. But as I heard from the electeds earlier, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, even when you're working towards that common regional goal, there are a lot of different factors for the communities that make up a region, and sometimes you have to take very different approaches to be successful. I had the opportunity last summer to present at the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City. That's a group of 9 counties and about 119 cities that make up that Kansas City region. They were a pilot project from the National League of Cities, the First Tier Suburbs Council, to really look at affordable housing specific to first-ring suburbs. And what they were finding, of course, was that a lot of the things that worked in the central city just simply didn't work well at their local level. A lot of it was financial. I heard Laura mention that the host department has a budget of $75 million, which is fantastic. And as you can see, we have an entire city budget in Westminster of only $350 million. So working with different resources in terms of staff and finances. Here are just some of our general demographics to provide a little bit of orientation. Roughly 120,000 people in Westminster. We have a well-educated workforce and a relatively high household income. We're part of the same Denver, Aurora, Lakewood region that Laura and Annalise spoke to. So our AMI in this area is 92,800 for a household of 4, relatively high. Not a great range of ethnic and racial diversity, typical of Colorado as a whole, but just not terribly diverse compared to the national spectrum. This gives you a little bit of a sense of what our workforce here in Westminster looks like. And this is important for us to understand. For a long time, Westminster pursued a strategy of executive housing to cater towards the US 36 tech corridor and primary employers. But what we didn't really think about at that time was the administrative support that share in the wealth of those companies. We also, because of Colorado tax structure, are heavily dependent on retail sales tax, so we pursued a lot of those uses. And over time, what we found was not only were those big firms and the administrative folks and the retail service providers not able to find things in their price range, there wasn't even stock that really matched their needs. So Westminster's housing stock wasn't keeping up with the demand. We lacked starter homes, townhomes, and a lot of those smaller footprint options. As I was starting to put this presentation together, my boss looked at this slide and said, "You can't put that in there because when you look at the numbers, it doesn't look like we would have a problem." And that was exactly the same reaction our city council had when we started working on this effort about 4 years ago was, well, those numbers just can't possibly be right. But they don't tell the whole story. Right, so when one sees that a person could buy a townhome in Westminster for $246,000, that seems pretty affordable. What you don't see is that we haven't really built any townhomes in the last 20 years. Most of that stock dates back to the 1980s, and even that has very, very little availability. There's just not enough there. So we have that very familiar supply problem that I think a lot of other communities in the room are probably experiencing. And then looking at the apartments, sure, we can tell you what the price is for a 3-bedroom apartment, but the number of them on the market is incredibly small. So we run into that same problem where there's a lot of 1-bedroom units, but those don't meet the needs of families, as Dr. Smith was speaking to earlier. So it's important, I think, just in that stage of collecting the data that you really know a lot of the subtext of your community and begin to develop strategies that target your unique needs. We are in the process right now of updating our housing needs assessment. So the data that's on the screen here was from our 2016 figures. But I think the trends you see here are probably not surprising and similar to a lot of your communities. Long wait lists for subsidized units, insufficient supply of for sale affordable options, a lot of rising need nationwide around the shifting demographics to more seniors. With that comes a lot of accessibility needs, and then also a higher number of families experiencing homelessness. Following that housing needs assessment, which was the first one that Westminster had done, I got to assemble a task force. And because it hadn't been done before, I had a lot of autonomy. And I'm going to commit a little bit of heresy for a moment here. Yes, it is very important to listen to your community. And we did a good job of community outreach and engagement on the front end, making sure that we had good data going into that. But if you try to make everything a public engagement process, you won't be able to get to the action step. And I'm sure some of you have run into that very problem. Similarly, if you let an effort like this become those competing budgets and agendas that always happen in local government will get in the way of critical thinking and problem solving. So this group, which was capped at 20, and not everyone participated on a regular basis, had representation from our public. We have an inclusivity board, so we had a liaison from that group. We also had some critical staff, but it was very heavily weighted to outside expertise. So we made sure that we had individuals in that room who could speak to a very broad range of community needs, but also had the technical expertise from a legal perspective. We had some construction knowledge in the room, so we could really talk about cost estimating factors. We talked about various real estate impacts, and that was important. No one in there had a personal stake in the outcome, but they all brought perspective to the table. And we would meet every month for about a 2-hour, very active work session over the period of 6 months, pretty rapid, but having that sort of momentum isn't something that you want to lose. So we pushed hard and fast. Like any good strategic planning effort, that task force started out from a place of vision and being able to articulate values. The third one up here, I think, is incredibly important, and Dr. Smith spoke to this a little bit earlier, that it's incredibly important for any plan, any sort of housing plan, to be sustainable. It has to be financially viable. And I'm going to pause here a moment, take a drink. So I think it's important to make that clear fact-based connection to the economics of affordable housing. And we have seen this play out a lot in our last legislative session and the current one we're in now, at both local and state levels, of connecting the finances of providing affordable housing to overall economic impact. Because affordable housing really is a nonpartisan issue, and framing it that way will often help to dislodge the NIMBY arguments and allow you to move forward in a more productive way. There are some overarching themes that emerged from our task force. You'll see some of those bulleted out here. It became very clear to us that we had to take a broad approach, both in terms of preserving what affordable existing housing stock we had, as well as creating new. Just to give it some measure of scale, since we started in 2015, we have about 1,127 units either delivered or in some stage of production and planning. So it's made a large dent in a community of our size quickly, still a long way to go. But part of that too is we also had to find a way to start dispersing the units that we were bringing online throughout the city. As any of you who have worked with federal funds know, the very structure of providing assistance to low to moderate income communities tends to then concentrate those financial resources in certain pockets. We had the older part of our community who felt they had really shouldered the unfair burden of affordable housing and they didn't want any more. So not only did we not want to compound the problem, but we really did see a need to make sure that some of our more affluent neighborhoods were also opened up, that we were connecting residents with opportunities for good education and good transit. So I really like the way that the city of Austin captures it, which is, they say, all kinds of homes for all kinds of people in all kinds of places. So coming out of that task force and really getting down to the disciplined thinking, you can't implement a vision if you don't start defining the objectives and realistic action items. And Mayor Woodard spoke to this earlier, right? The need for an action plan. So as our task force wrapped up, I worked with our consultant. I'll tell you exactly what this looked like. I had at that time a large empty wall in my house, and it was covered in a rainbow of Post-its trying to distill all of these notes down into some concrete strategies. We came up finally with the 8 that are listed here. Each of them has an accompanying policy statement, and then nested under that are a series of action items. Those action items then got sorted into buckets of near-term, short-term, and long-term based on budget cycle. So we wanted to make sure that we did capture some of that low-hanging fruit and get the momentum going, but we had to have some aspirational items to work towards as well. So our Affordable and Workforce Housing Strategic Plan went into effect in October of 2017. It has been very effective, but I would be sugarcoating it if I said that everyone liked it then or liked it now. That is not the case. I think anytime you dare to go past that point of articulating vision and start the implementation process, it is going to be that commitment of time and resources and effort that will meet some resistance. But don't let it keep you and your community from moving forward. And also don't let perfect become the enemy of the good. You've got to start making some progress to get the momentum going. Nobody wants to see the plan sit on the shelf. So as we started to tackle some of those actions that we had laid out for ourselves, one of them was to create the first community land trust in our city. We fortunately had a member of the task force who had some connection to that, and Laura works with her now. Deborah Bustos of the Urban Land Conservancy helped us get this project going. And I wanted to highlight it because I think it's something that is applicable to so many communities. There was a project known as Holly Park, started in the early 2000s by a private developer to do 70 townhomes, ran into financial troubles, and had the 12 units that you see on the left-hand side were completed. There were some others that were open pits or foundations that were incomplete. The property was tied up for quite some time in bank repossession. Finally, the city condemned it, but the property sat for a while because we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do with it, how we were going to finish out this townhome community. And finally, through our work on the affordable housing front, we found a partner. I had to convince the finance department that it was okay to write off the debt associated with the condemnation to accomplish a larger objective. So we donated this land in December of 2018 for $1, removing that barrier of land cost. The city is also going in and redoing some of the utilities that had aged in that property. And so I think the important lesson here is to look for those partners that can bring other things to the table, but also recognize whether you're a city or a county or playing another role here, what it is that you can bring to the table. It's really going to take that sort of collaborative mindset to unlock some of those barriers. I also wanted to just touch briefly on 2 of our projects. So since we work in a less urban environment, making sure that we're very thoughtful about where we place density is important so that we don't have to deal with the NIMBY argument. We have 5 focus areas in our comprehensive plan, and those seek to integrate infrastructure, transit, and the mix of uses into a more compact area. Our 2 primary focus areas are downtown Westminster, which is a 105-acre site that was a former regional mall. And then we have bus rapid transit that serves that area. We also have Westminster Station, which is on the commuter rail line. So it's the first stop out of Denver Union Station heading towards Boulder. In those areas, we have sort of different dynamics. The first one, the city owns the entirety of the 105-acre site. We're going through block by block and developing that in partnership with private developers. There we have a 20% goal of affordable housing, so 80% AMI and below for our definition. At Westminster Station, which is represented in the lower left, we have our public housing authority as the largest landholder in that area. And so we work closely with them to make sure that we're really bringing balance to the neighborhood, not only getting the range of incomes, but also the types of amenities and support services to really make it a healthy area. So these are just two projects to highlight. We certainly have others, but I think they do a really nice job of demonstrating the value of connecting the housing and the transit. And as I start to wrap up, I wanted to make sure just to identify some of the major lessons that we have learned that are hopefully valuable to all of you. Always keeping in mind that affordable housing has its own set of timing sensitivity that doesn't necessarily mesh well with municipal processes. And the more you know about that, the more effective you can be in negotiating deals that can actually come to fruition. Also going into it with some appreciation and understanding for the different perspectives between a public developer or a private developer, nonprofit versus for-profit. None of them are bad, they're just different. Certainly when you can work with mission-aligned organizations together, it's going to be easier. Not necessarily critical, but makes it a little easier. Also, the immediate value we found as a community in just declaring our openness to affordable housing. It was not something Westminster had ever articulated before, and once we did, we found a lot of great partners willing to come to the table. Number 4 is something that I would imagine most people can relate to, even if they don't talk about it a lot, which is there is going to be organizational conflict. When you take on something like affordable housing, we still don't have complete vision alignment inside the city of Westminster. There are certainly staff and electeds that don't feel the city should play any role in affordable housing. I don't know if there's a way to get around that other than strong leadership and consistency, but anticipating it and preparing for it was important. Also, never depending on tax credits or federal funds to be the answer to everything. To put this in some perspective, at Westminster, we are an entitlement community, but we only get about $550,000 in CDBG funds every year, of which we finance some staff salary out of that and do some other programs, and about $160,000 in home funds. So those alone will never close any gap, but applied strategically and leveraged, they still have great value. Then also the importance of having champions at both the political and a leadership level. We very nearly didn't get the affordable housing strategic plan put into place. It took the persistence of a few electeds that were really willing to back that up. Not surprisingly, it has actually launched 3 of them to higher political careers for doing so. So find those that have the courage and really want to push it and let them run with it. Also, I think we found that establishing common vocabulary and concepts at the outset was very important. And then lastly, don't be afraid to build the airplane while you're flying it. We were told very firmly that don't stop making deals while you're working on the plan, just keep pushing forward. So on that note, I would encourage all of you to do the same and turn this over to Q&A session.
So our Colorado presenters are available both online and in person to answer any questions you have. So line up as before, and they can hear you.
Hi, my name is John O'Loughlin, resident here in Tacoma. I'm curious about that very first presentation where they showed the rents going up by 68%, but at the same time, homelessness went down. And I know that's the point of a lot of the work that you're doing, but I wonder if there's other things at work besides these affordable housing programs that can account for that sort of counterintuitive outcome?
Laura, I'm going to let you respond to that if possible.
Sure, I'll take myself off mute. I think that first I will say that we have inconsistent methodology over the course of the last several years as far as measuring the number of people experiencing homelessness. I think that it is the point in time is a snapshot. It is a flawed and incomplete snapshot, but it does give us a snapshot. I think that the numbers that we saw in the first couple of years in that slide that I showed from 2012 and 2013, there are some inconsistencies with how data was collected at that time compared to how it's been collected now. So I think that it's probably a little bit more effective to look at beyond 2014, where there's a little bit more consistency in how we take that data, which we have seen a slight rise in homelessness since that period. It's more like 5 or 6%, not like 15, which is the citywide population growth. But I understand that that does create some confusion. So we have seen some rise, but not larger than the population at large in Denver.
I have a few questions. The first one is, so I know that the community land trust model is a model that's like really rooted in being community vision led and built. Like that's kind of how the start of it is. And so I'm wanting to hear more about how do y'all do community land trust work that's rooted in connection with grassroots organizing, and does your like the way y'all do it, is it in more of a supportive role or leadership? I'm just wanting to hear how that looks like for y'all. My next question is for Annalise. I'm just asking if you can talk more about what does having incentives that lead to community benefits look like in a very tangible way, because I feel like we have some proposed incentives, but nothing with any like actual tangible way of accountability. It's just like produce some affordable units, but no like number or like, so what do those community benefits, what could they look like? And then one last question about donating land, and just asking how do y'all go about prioritizing folks who receive that land, whether it's community organizations, organizing groups, and how do y'all support those groups to have the capacity to receive it? Because a lot of people who have the solutions may not actually know how to do it, but are there ways that you support them in that?
So since there were 3 parts to the question, I think, Laura, if you take the first one, I'll take the second, and then maybe Jenny, you can take the third.
Sure, sounds good.
So this is Laura. For that first question, we announced last year that we, as the City and County of Denver, are making a $5.5 million investment into land trusts, as well as models that use other long-term affordability to help support residents. We are moving those contracts forward through the process of approval at this point. But part of that includes an investment towards a new land trust that's been created in our community. It's the Globeville and Elyria Swansea GES coalition has been working to create a community land trust with those same focuses that you mentioned about community stewardship, community input, community support for a land trust model as part of that overall support for land trust and other long-term affordability models moving forward.
So I'll take the second one in terms of what are some tangible incentives. So density and height is certainly one of them, and I think what works well at the 38th and Blake Station area and what we're proposing citywide is it's very clear in terms of what is required. So once you go above a certain height threshold, there's a formula that, there's one-pager handouts and then there's actual form itself, but you can very clearly calculate based off of your square footage of incentive height that you're wanting to leverage what that affordability commitment is going to be. If it's entering into a negotiated process, that's not a zoning incentive, that's a negotiated process. And so I think and it's not saying that negotiated processes are off the table. If anything, our council members often think that we get better results out of that, but I would say we get fewer results out of that. So predictability is key. In that part of 38th and Blake, we also do have a community serving use option, but because it requires negotiation, it's been used 0 times. So I think it speaks to having predictable, tangible incentives. So height's certainly one. Parking reductions is another one. Build it into the system, though. Do different rates at different AMI levels or bedroom types. Make sure your community is comfortable with it, but just have it be as administrative and easily predictable as possible. Fee waivers is another option to consider, as well as expedited permitting. However, acknowledging that that requires sometimes additional staffing and resources. So being able to balance and understand what the administrative impacts too of those systems are. When you're asking people to negotiate, that also takes more staff time. So streamlining is a win-win for everyone in the community, but I would say kind of financial incentives, expedited permitting, parking reductions, and height are the ones that we've found to be most meaningful with our community. And then Jenny.
Yeah, actually, and that's a really good segue, because I think, so sort of what I tried to touch on before is some of the incentives may look different in an urban dense environment. 38th and Blake Station is a great example in Denver where height and density bonuses have real value. We toyed around with that a little bit at Westminster Station, and there was no value in it yet. So that's an area where a builder can go up to 8 stories, but because construction costs really change at that 5-story limit, you switch over in building code, nobody's pushed that yet. So adding that in as an incentive wouldn't have done anything for us. So I think being mindful of what's of value in your community. We have found, I think we've gotten the greatest bang for the buck out of just going to tax and fee rebates. That has a huge value in and of itself. It's also, it's sort of an intangible, but signaling that willingness to partner and really help projects, even if not in an expedited fashion, move through the system in a coordinated way is invaluable to most developers, knowing that they have an advocate on the city side that is going to try to make sure that the project moves through smoothly is important. Back to the part though about how with our land dedication we've prioritized. So first we just had to go through and do a really good inventory. I mean, we had assets that we didn't even know that we had. And that led us to work at a state level last legislative session on getting statewide land use inventory into a more user-friendly format, just so that we're aware of those assets we have out there to work with. Putting land into the deal costs a city nothing, but it has huge benefit on the development pro forma. And so what we have done once we got the inventory, and not all of those properties were really good candidates for housing, but of those that are, it's looking at what the surrounding context needs. So the Holly Park site that I put up first, that was an area where it was really important to build into that context of the surrounding townhomes. And we knew that we were going to be needing some additional for sale affordable housing at that price point. So we really only had 2 development options within sort of our larger Denver metro area of who does affordable for sale. So talk to both of those. I think we have another property. So the one that we selected for Holly Park will not be the one that we select for the other site. It's trying to spread that diversity around a little bit. But you've got to know what it is you're trying to achieve to sort of identify the right partners to target.
Hi, my name is Beryl Fernandez. I'm an independent consultant here locally, a PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. Doesn't matter. You guys are just as. I have a comment. It's an impressive array of approaches and strategies and actions that you've given us, a lot of food for thought. My question is, how do you convince yourselves, your decision makers and funders, and the users, most importantly, that you are being effective? 2, what specific metrics are you using? And 3, can you share with us a link to outcome-based evaluation reports?
I can tee it up and then you guys can jump in a little bit there. I think in terms of how to communicate that we're being effective on the onset, setting clear goals and numbers that we know are realistic, but we're, as I kind of made mention earlier, you're building in a system of monitoring and tracking. Our comprehensive plan also put a series of metrics in that we've committed to annual updates and evaluation of. So I think not being willing, or being willing to put a number out there, and publicly doing so you can say, yes, we're meeting our goals, or no, we're falling short and we need to reevaluate the tools that we're leveraging. I think for many years, Denver, and I'm sure many other communities, have kind of been in a reactive stance where we're just kind of throwing everything that we can at housing and jobs. And in some ways, I'm like, maybe a slowdown would be good, because it would help us take the time to really evaluate more holistically. But I think on the onset, all the projects that I lead, I really try to prioritize putting those metrics in and being able to build in staffing capacity to track and monitor those over time so we can respond. Do you guys want to jump in on that, or the latter part of the question?
Yeah, I'll add a little something. Yes to all of that. I think it's also important that you have that anecdotal information too. So when we have residents of those units stand up and speak during public comment periods and express their appreciation for the value of having an affordable and safe place to live, that carries a lot of weight too. And I think it's important to have the balance of the data with the personal stories. And I'm not sure, I would imagine Laura and Annalise hear that as well. It's also valuable to have the development partners provide feedback as to what was or wasn't effective in process.
This is Laura. I can jump in a little bit as well, because one of your questions was about what I will translate into performance-based contracting. And I think it's a really great question that we're making some transitions to try and do more of not just the activity associated with the investment that we supported an organization with, but what was the outcome that was associated with that investment. And I will just highlight one thing that's been happening in Denver over the last couple of years, which is a pay-for-success model. It's called the Social Impact Bond, that was essentially analyzing data related to the residents who are experiencing homelessness in our city and who are chronically homeless, but we're also high utilizers of emergency rooms, detox centers, jails, and really tried to provide housing as well as really significant services to serve those residents. And so we created about 250 units with these intensive services that are we utilize the social impact bond for. And basically the upfront dollars to provide the services for those residents are paid back based on savings from jails, from detox centers, from health centers, to help pay back the investors based on those long-term savings. And so far it's been a really effective program for us. 2 years after implementation, 90% of participants remained housed. So that was a pretty significant investment for us and tool as a city that was really a pay-for-success model that I would certainly be happy to share more information on.
Hi, my name is Al Ratcliffe. The City of Tacoma Human Rights Commission and the City of Tacoma Planning Commission are in the very early stages of creating a work group to focus on trying to introduce more equity into the development process, or awareness of equity. And we had been thinking in terms essentially of the two bodies creating a subcommittee that would turn out some sort of questionnaire or checklist or something. If I hear your presentation correctly, you would more likely recommend that we create a process that involves discussion with a number of those stakeholders that then may lead to a checklist or something. Am I hearing you correctly?
Was it for me or for Laura?
I think for you.
I think it was for you in regard to the advisory committee and the diversity.
Sure. I think you want to make sure that you've got the community voice represented. Incredibly important. But what I've seen, and I've watched this play out in a lot of our other city planning efforts not related to housing, where for all the right reasons, have created a very long and detailed community engagement process, and you start to get fatigue, right? That it can go on too long, and you have to sort of know a point at which you're going to draw that line and say, okay, we've moved from the community input gathering. Now we've got to sort of sit down and do the vetting process and bring in the technical expertise to distill it down. I think it's very good then to follow that up with taking it back out to the community to kind of do a check to make sure that you've heard them correctly, that this looks right, it reflects where they want it to go. But it's a little bit of an unfair expectation that your resident community is necessarily going to have all of the technical expertise needed to really vet some of the particular actions you want to take. We wouldn't have had any residents at that time who had a lot of experience, say, around a community land trust. We needed to get some of that expertise from outside. So it's important to find the balance between the community voice in saying this is what's important, this is what we want our vision to look like, and having the experts provide the how to get there.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Thank you. I just want to thank you for your presentations today. I had, it's a little bit of a just general question. I've heard the mention of housing families and the importance and the vulnerability of families lately, and it's something that's really important to me. And I guess I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts or any tools that you have been able to utilize to make sure that units that are available for families are built. I know that sometimes when you increase the zoning envelope, that sometimes it is really attractive to build a lot of micro units, right? Because that's a really great way to get a lot of units as a developer, and it's less attractive to build 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. So I do want to know what kind of tools, policy tools, or any other tools that you have seen or used to make that happen. Thank you.
Does anyone want to jump in on that, or?
Sure,
Go ahead, Laura.
Sure, I just wanted to maybe give a couple of comments, and I want to just recognize that we as a community in Denver, I think, are having conversation both on the investment side and on the policy side about how do we do that better. So I think we have a couple of things that have been used in the past, but it's a conversation for us about how we do more. But I just want to touch on 2 ways that I think we have done it in the past that could be ways to explore. We had an inclusionary housing ordinance I mentioned until 2016. It no longer applies to new projects, so this is not something that is actively being utilized. But what that did, for example, is set a standard 10% requirement of units that needed to be affordable because of the inclusionary policy, but it allowed for someone to build fewer than 10% of the units if they were more bedrooms or deeper affordability or other ways to serve residents that got towards some objectives that were more than just basic affordable. Without that, the 10% needed to be consistent with the market rate units. So if all of your market rate units are 1 bedrooms, your affordable could be 1 bedrooms as well. So that was one policy way that we were able to accept fewer units in exchange for more bedrooms. We've also utilized a similar approach on larger development agreements where we have a set standard, but there's more value placed on units that are higher bedrooms, which overall decreases the percentage of units. I think we're continuing to explore ways on, maybe how do we do both? How do we get units and get more bedrooms? But it's something that's an ongoing conversation. But Annalise, please feel free to add to that.
I'm just going to jump on almost 2 different topics of that. One of which was mentioned earlier of, we have co-working spaces. How does that translate to housing? So a project that I'm not working on but very close to is we as a city are updating how we regulate our definition of household and other types of things. Right now, a household is 2 people. And then an unlimited amount of relatives and things like that. But it really is not in alignment with how people are choosing to live as families. I think the concept of family is morphing and evolving. And so I was like, if I could update my slide, I would add another one in there of making sure that your definition of household is relevant and inclusive to the variety of communities, especially if we look at refugee families. Those are typically ones that are living, a lot of people in a household, but that's very culturally relevant and appropriate for them. So that's one way, is how do we just take our existing single-family areas and create them to be more inclusive for our families. Now, that has come with a lot of resistance right now, as it also includes things like smaller group living uses that previously had a lot more restrictions, like sober living, but we're saying, hey, if, 8 people want to live together and choose not to drink, if anything, I want them to be my neighbors. They're going to be a lot quieter than ours. So, so we're looking at all of those different things in terms of also how do we remove barriers for new types of families and organizations to exist. The other thing is in Blueprint Denver, our land use plan, we have a series of different equity maps. So looking at, and one of which is improving jobs and housing diversity. So when we look at our housing diversity, that's one of the equity metrics that we're using to evaluate proposed rezonings and large development agreements. And so having that data readily available to understand where we don't have the housing diversity and larger family types helps us direct our resources and our negotiations, and where we know that we have better housing diversity, maybe that's not as much of a focus in terms of our negotiations. And I would anticipate as we kind of develop the Citywide tool, we might only allow for family style units to be built through the incentive system in those areas where we know we have a high need.